with the
Yeah.
Texas Motorplex stuff and on social media because we weren't there. But man, there was tons of people talking like, why aren't they running quarter mile? And here we go back to the whole quarter mile, eighth mile, 1,000-foot talk again. And man, we we talk about this a lot, don't we? And I mean, and I get it. I mean, because there's a lot of fans out there that aren't as hardcore and don't really like where Mike's from. Eighth mile racing is. I mean,
Yeah, this is
that's
the
the
whole
thing, right, Mike?
blowback on the whole blowback on Eighth Mile honestly is kind of new to me. I mean,
Yeah,
we see a
for
lot of
sure.
feedback on the show when we start talking about these race distances. To me, there's always been two. There's eighth and quarter, and where we're from, you race both, and you have a setup that's interchangeable, at least back in the day. And 1,000 foot is a little bit of the bastard child, but as time goes on, we're accepting it. But the race distances are quite a controversy. And I think in some of these, to me, the funny car chaos thing, the reason why you saw some of the blowback on that is because that is nitro funny cars race to the quarter mile. And that's a Southern California old school from the origination of the sport that these things race quarter mile. So we've really only got one measuring stick to go by when it comes to those classes. Or that class. So running an eighth mile probably did seem a little bit odd to these guys, but I'm sure what's your take on it, Wes? I mean, there's obvious rationale for doing it. And in today's times, especially with the performance of these cars, but what did you see besides what we saw on social media? What did you see at the track or here at the track? You said you were up there in the stands with the fans. Did you hear any of that there?
I actually literally turned around and started asking people because I was seeing it on social media. Like I was pulling up, I was actually checking to see how our live stream was performing. For those that don't know, that we have a partnership with Flow Racing, and they were broadcasting a free preview of Funny Car Chaos on the Drag Illustrated page. And I just pulled it up to see like how the numbers were doing, and I wanted to watch along and look at the broadcast for a minute. So I was sitting in the stands, and I just kept seeing these comments are like, the only thing wrong is they're not running quarter mile. And I thought, man, are people really that hung up on this? It surprised me a little bit because let's talk about the fact there's 60 freaking funny cars here, right? I mean, there's Al Hoffman's son is here. Like there's all these storylines that we could be talking about, but somehow, some way we find a way to tear it down, or we find a way to beat on it. And it basically focused on the fact that they're racing eighth mile. So I started turning around and asking friends and asking people in the stands, like, some of the first people I asked, Frank and Fran from Phoenix, Arizona, West Coast guys, right? I said, what do you guys make of, are you turned on by the quarter mile versus eighth mile thing? Are you passionate? Does this one way or the other, does this event mean less to you because it's eighth mile versus quarter mile? What's your take? And they both looked at me as just like passionate drag racing fans that don't necessarily have a really crazy technical understanding of what's going on. They're like, whatever. We want to see some header flames and some close drag racing and loud cars and some big burnouts, and we don't really care. But then I talked to some other guys, older gentlemen, who's probably, and I would say is early 70s. He looked at me, he's like, yeah, it's the only thing wrong with this deal. They need to be running them things to the scoreboards. He literally said, I didn't know they were going to race half track. Right. And I'm like,
it's crushing when you hear them say half track, right?
Half track is a little bit of a punch in the stomach.
I'm a little bit torn on this, but I can't disagree with the second gentleman there that had that feeling because of the venue. And that's a venue where the stands go all the way to the end. I mean, we want to see them fit in the venue. Tell me that race, if they're doing the same show at Eddyville Raceway, this is not a completely different.
Do you remember it was bananas, the reaction to Scott Palmer making that low 3-second run last year at Eddyville Raceway Park in Southeast Iowa, right? Because it's a nitty gritty eighth mile drag strip. And my hot take on quarter mile versus eighth mile versus 1,000-foot, and I'm going to lean into what you said, Mike, the bastard child distance being 1,000-foot. That's the newest one.
We're going to call it that from now on.
Yeah, it's it is. My hot take on it is there's room for all of it. I know I wrote an article in the magazine.
Just not at the same time.
No, not at the same time. But 100 years ago, that much like NASCAR has short track like Bristol, right? That they make special by running them at night or running them on dirt or whatever, right? Then you've got super speedways, Talladega, right? Where we're going 200 miles an hour, whatever you want to call it. And we've got road courses that also serve a purpose, and everybody kind of shines in a different place, right? I mean, I think that could work. I think that it has a lot to do with the venue. Like, you can't run, in my opinion, and this is different things. I have a different opinion for like
it has
funny
all
car
to do
chaos.
with the venue, man. Think about it. Like, to your
It is all
comparison,
about the venue.
what you just said about NASCAR and everything. If you imagine if you went to Daytona and then they just used like
The
some
infield.
small circle track on the infield, and you're like, guys, this is Daytona. It's a 2.5 mile course, and you're down there in the middle. We can't even see you or whatever. And
Right.
so it's all, but yet that same performance at Bristol is like, holy shit, this is incredible. It's
Dion
all
just,
about that.
Dion
think
just
that-
messaged me like, think about going to an NBA game, and you show up and then they play 5-on-5 half court.
I really think that's a
it's
great.
similar. But
It
but
is,
see, like the
man.
fans, but if you knew that going in and you were like, I got to get my seats down here on this side where they're playing, that's a different thing. If you're unaware and you're just like on the other end of the court and they're way down there at the end,
Like,
I've seen this
shit.
actually. We're talking about the Final Four. I remember back in the day, the Final Four, or even probably recently, would be played at like the Alamo Dome in San Antonio. And this is this massive multi-use facility, and you've got a basketball game going on, and it's like they're using a quarter of the facility
Floor,
for it, and
yeah.
there's this whole dark area, and it just looks weird. Even the players said that their shooting
Felt
was off
weird. Yeah, it
because
felt weird.
the distance to the
Mhm.
behind the goal to like the wall or whatever. So again, and it's one of the biggest sports weekends in basketball, and we're presenting it in this, in this
Not-
too big of an arena.
I think that the venue makes all the difference. You see it with musical acts all the time,
Yeah.
right? Like the stage setup is different when they're doing a show at a nightclub or a small auditorium versus a massive arena, right? Or an outdoor amphitheater. So, I mean, I'm telling you, when the Midwest Drag Racing Series introduced Top Alcohol Funny Car, whatever that was, a year or so ago, 2 years ago, I went to the first ever race, I believe it was, at first ever Top Alcohol Funny Car race they had at Midwest at Extreme Raceway Park, the aforementioned awesome 8th Mile drag racing facility right here outside of Dallas and Ferris, Texas. And when they cranked up those 2 alcohol funny cars and they did burnouts and they backed up and they started revving them things up, getting ready to swap feet, you'd have thought Jesus was coming. I mean, I'm telling you, I've got goosebumps. Again, I mean, it gave me... I mean, I was in the tower, and you'd have thought the stands are close to the track, and the tower's close to the track, and them things are 6,000-7,000 RPM, blah, 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 fumes everywhere. And you
That's
go,
what it's about, man.
It is.
this is badass. But you take those exact 2 cars, I don't know who it was. I think it was like Sean Bellemere and Annie Whiteley. And you take those exact 2 cars, and you go run them 8th Mile at the Motorplex, 15 minutes away. Totally different experience. It smacks of sportsman racing or whatever. Like, it's just a totally different thing. So I do think that promoters have to at least consider that. But there's so many things that go into it, because a lot of the time I've had this conversation with Tyler Crosno and the gang at PDRA. I think some of their events would really work well at smaller venues, but the smaller venues can't house them. The smaller venues can't house 400 or 500 race cars or whatever the
And
case
they don't
may
have,
be.
and the track surface is not what there are very few A-level 8th Mile facilities. Like Galot comes to mind. Got the stands, got the tower, got all the parking you could ever want, and a badass 8th Mile surface. That's perfect. But then to get that surface and those accommodations, you basically got to go quarter mile. I mean, we saw this at the start of the ADRL. Remember, we used to go to Huntsville. Hub City Dragway. I mean, have you ever even heard of Hub City Dragway?
Yeah,
and
man.
So, and we're racing pro mods there. And then by the end of it, we're at ZMAX. We're at, St. Louis. We're at a lot of these
mega facilities, right?
Yeah.
And I really think that if we are at all concerned or paying attention whatsoever to the entertainment value and user experience, right? The customer experience, I think you got to race 8th Mile at 8th Mile tracks, and you got to run quarter mile at quarter mile tracks. And if you can't run quarter mile, like English Town, obviously they've shut this place down, and this is actually a fairly good segue to the next conversation, or one of the next conversations.
A+
but
segue.
Thank you. I didn't even mean to do that, actually. That was a pure accident. And I'm not quite done on this quarter mile, 8th Mile, 1,000-foot thing, bastard length racing. So it's
I'm gonna get called to the principal's office.
We're gonna get in trouble on that deal. But I really think whenever I think about Englishtown, that was probably my favorite racetrack in the country. There's an air about Old Bridge Township Raceway Park in New Jersey. I mean, it's just a incredible
that was the
facility.
widest drag strip of all
Dude, it's
time.
wide.
I always
you could
said
run
that it was
16 wide on that thing.
It was as wide as it was long.
You know what? It's not total stretch, right? Because that's the whole issue that I was getting ready to talk about.
First time we raced there, I didn't know where to stand after staging the car up. Like, damn, the wall's usually over here.
I think I'm just going to lay down over here. There's a lot of room, bro. I'm going to get off the subject. But so when whenever NHRA switched to 1,000 foot, there's a couple things that I think are worth noting. Dude, that was a long time ago. It's weird, and that's why I wanted to bring this back up and talk about it. And I think it's something that we're probably going to be talking about on this show. We're not going to stop talking about this anytime soon. It's one of the great debatable subjects in drag racing. And for whatever reason, it still feels fresh to me, right? Like it still feels fresh. But they started this in 2008. The first ever NHRA national event to be contested on the 1,000 foot was in Denver, Colorado, the Mile High Nationals, like the second weekend in July in 2008. That's been a long time
I didn't know
ago.
that Bandamere was the first one.
Yeah, Bandamere was the first one. That was the next stop
event after Englishtown.
Yeah, that was the next stop after Englishtown. So Englishtown
they made
happens.
That decision that quickly.
Well, they didn't have a choice. This is something that I don't know people fully understand. A lot of people go, NHRA switched it to 1,000 foot. The racers demanded it. The professional racing organization, led by Kenny Bernstein at the time, they demanded it. They basically, and I didn't see any of the paperwork or any of the exchange. I wasn't on the phone, but the way it was explained to me and the way it was presented to me was the racers basically said, you either change from a quarter mile to 1,000 foot or we're not coming to Denver, period. It was probably one of the most successful racers banding together moments in the history of drag racing.
Might be
because
the
they basically the only one.
And what power does that show? We've always said, if racers want to protest a rule or a situation or anything, band together, no one show up and make a stand, and it will change.
The problem
there'll be
is that it takes one guy to blow it up.
Yeah, I'm gonna show up and win this race and get me a trophy and a check.
And there are examples of that, right?
Oh, yeah.
And that's the problem, is that I think that the risk of it is you can get this whole group together and everybody may say what they're supposed to say on the conference call or the Zoom meeting, but the days before the race, when they're calling and they want you to come or whatever, and there's an opportunity to go qualify number one and win because you're the only one there. I mean, the shirts aren't going to read any different, right? Whenever you get the shirts printed, you wanted a Wally your whole life. And now I'm going to go get one in Denver at one of the biggest races on the tour.
Yeah, guys, I'm boycotting that this week too, as you're pulling in the gates, getting your wristbands.
Yeah, no shit, right?
I mean, it's
what they do too.
And they would do it, right? So when that happened, and it did happen fast, to your point, I mean, we lost Scott Coletta in June, late, whatever it was. I think the 17th, mid-June of 2008, unfortunate accident, right? We lose one of the greatest to ever do it, an icon still to this day. Scott Coletta passes away in the shutdown at Englishtown Raceway, Old Bridge Township Raceway Park. And the reaction, the next race was to switch from quarter mile to 1,000 foot. So my take on this is, in the instance of Englishtown, say that track was still on the NHRA series, my suggestion would be, this track is landlocked. It's not long enough to run quarter mile. So we're going to run 1/8 mile here. And this is going to be one of the tracks where a lower budget team or a team that's got some experience match racing or whatever may be able to kind of get themselves in the mix with the Steve Torrances and the John Force Racings and whatnot. Because
could push their stuff hard to the 1/8 mile, but not to the quarter or to 1,000 foot.
Right. Like maybe just as an example, maybe Scott Palmer shows up at the 1/8 mile race in Englishtown and wins the damn thing. Right. Because he's got a killer. I mean, obviously all these guys have killer everything tune-ups, but I'm just saying that I think that could work. Now, obviously you got the whole added expense. Now we got to buy gears to run, rear gears and transmission, for pro stock and these other classes. But
they don't care when they're making other rules, though, about expenses. So
no, I agree. I'm just saying, I think there's room for all of it. I'm definitely a red or blue. I'm a real big quarter mile and 1/8 mile fan. I think 1,000 foot, even though we just established that we've been doing this for a long time, since 2008, it still is unfamiliar to me, and it still feels unfamiliar to me. It's not a metric that really fits with my, I mean, you know what I'm saying? I understand that like a 360 run is fast, right?
It's hard to
And
compare. It's hard to compare.
It is, man.
To past performances, and just to give you something. But like Dion Walrath, our producer, he's saying he's a younger guy, newer to the sport than we are. 1,000 foot's all he's ever really known from his experience. So
it's almost irrelevant.
We're getting to the point 15,
maybe,
14 years
unless
in,
you talk
where
about
there's a whole generation of fans that have only known 1,000 foot.
For the 1,000 foot. But, you know, and we've talked about this before as well. When we're talking NHRA, this is a whole different ball game. You know, if you're talking the tracks, that's one thing. But if you're going to talk about maybe pro mod going back to 8th mile, you know, and that's where I think you can't you go back to the half track, full track, you know,
right?
To the fans showing up, they're running full track, they're running 3/4 of track,
you can't,
and they're running
the
half
track,
event. And then that's I mean, like that would
at the same event, it would look bad.
It would look bad. But Wes, don't you have some stuff coming down the pipeline here in a couple of days? Maybe you're dropping about the 8th mile racing.
Well, maybe, and that's thank you for that, because I had a conversation literally last week, and I had never thought about this. But just using the NHRA Pro Mod series as an example, there's a lot of buzz around seeing that series go from 1/4 mile to 8th mile. I mean, I've heard it from very high up, you know, I've heard it from in the pits, I've heard it on the phone. There's a lot of talk about that series transitioning from 1/4 mile racing, which it has been since its inception, to 8th mile. But one of the points that someone made to me is the cars, the NHRA Pro Mod cars, the numbers showing up on the scoreboard would be nearly identical to the numbers showing up on the scoreboard when Top Fuel runs, but 100 miles an hour slower, right? So you have Stevie Jackson going out there and running 370, let's say at 200. And then the 10 minutes before that, Steve Torrance is going 370 at 330. It's confusing.
Yeah,
to 1,000 foot, it's
right.
confusing.
I had not thought about that.
Well, it would look horrible.
It would be very weird.
Look horrible.
So that's another
it would look
reason.
You're like, why the hell they? I mean,
I talked to another guy who we have a killer interview that's going to drop later this week, early next, where I did a sit down long form interview, and almost the only thing we talked about with this subject. So I've got a lot of material on this, but
oh boy,
his stance is you have to do it
time
universally. Like, we're going to 8th mile. We're going to 8th mile, and everything is going to be better. Because to segue or to bookend this and wrap back around to Funny Car Chaos, I don't think that event works 1/4 mile. None of those guys are going to run. When it sucks. None of those guys. It's asking too much of them. There's so many factors that come into play.
The NHRA
safety,
factor,
expense.
Talking about NHRA and these different distances. To me, it's getting to the point where 1/4 mile racing is almost the last foothold that NHRA has over these other series. And especially when it comes to Pro Mod, especially when think of
we've
how many
heard Lyle say that.
Think about how many series. Well, just all kinds of even Nostalgia Funny Car, even a lot of these series. There used to be more 1/4 mile options. And if you want to race 1/4 mile anything, NHRA is almost becoming your only option. And I think they need to double down and buy into that.
I think that they've got like two distinct paths. I agree. You either got to go all in on it and find a way to get everybody running a 1/4 mile, which is the dream scenario for me, would be to see the entire NHRA return to 1/4 mile racing.
And they go to, they have a foothold on all the facilities to do this for the most part, outside of a handful.
And to me, the Top Fuel and Funny Car is too fast already. I mean, they were too fast when they were going 1/4 mile, and they're too fast now. Right? I mean, now instead of they were going 300 mid 330s, right? 333, 334 in the 1/4 mile. Now they're doing the same thing in the 1,000 foot. The problem is racers are going to racer, right? And they're going to find a way to shorten the fuse, and they can't help it, right? And that's what makes them racers, and that's what makes our sport the greatest motorsport in the world, right? And it's so much a part of our identity, but someone has to protect them from themselves. And I think that for me, I would rather see, it's like one of those classic deals where you got to take a step back to take a step forward. Is there going to be some pain and agony and some expense associated with getting slowing these cars down, whatever it is, different blowers, different fuel pumps, change into a single magneto. I don't know. I'm not near smart enough to figure out how to slow those cars down, but I am faithful and confident that there are people out there that could do it, that could slow these cars down via reduction in downforce, via reduction in, we've seen trying to slow them down via reduction of track prep was not well received, right? But I think that there is a way to slow these cars down where they're still impressive. They still got massive header flames. They're still running over 300 miles an hour, which I think is all that matters. I really think as long as it's 300 something, we're still the fastest sport in fastest motorsport. It's still a spectacle. They still make 10,000 horsepower. You can say all these things. We still have all of our marketing material that we've used and leaned on for years and years and years, for decades, if you will. But I truly believe that if you're gonna run one class quarter mile, you got to run them all quarter mile. It's so odd to me that it would literally, I could make a lot of analogies and I won't bore you guys with them, but I agree with the thought of getting it all back to quarter mile or finding a way to get everybody racing on the exact same distance. Because I hate to reuse again the Fast and Furious line, but this is everybody. The quarter mile is the metric, man. I mean, if you pick up an issue of Car and Driver, if you pick up an issue of Motor Trend and they're reviewing a new vehicle, it doesn't say what the new Tesla's 1,000-foot clocking is. It says what it runs in the quarter mile. Everybody knows that distance. That is the universal ruler, right? That is the universal yardstick for car automotive performance. What's that bad boy? I mean, I think there's two metrics, 0 to 60 and quarter mile. Those are the automotive metrics that gearheads and hot rodders and performance car enthusiasts look to. And I think trying to retrain the world, the fact that we're still talking about 1,000-foot racing basically tells me all I need to know. We're struggling to accept it. We've accepted it begrudgingly, I think. And I know that a lot of racers have been very vocal that they don't support a return to quarter mile, but it's all rooted in safety and expense. And I just believe, I have a lot of faith in this. I mean, we're trying to go to Mars, right? There's wild shit happening in the world. We've got electric cars that are running 8s in the quarter mile. I mean, there's another example of the quarter mile being the metric. I think we have to find a way